Welcome to the Wolf Power Club, the weekly podcast where we discuss energy, industry and politics. I'm your host Alex. I've sold and bought a few companies and also I've sold billions of litres. Join me on this journey to net zero. Download on Apple Podcasts. Season 1 brought to you by AIM Recruit, the leading recruiters in logistics, transport and energy at www.aimrecruit.com. Today is a very special day for the Wolf Power Club podcast. We have a man who served 14 years in government. He got to the highest position of Secretary of State under Boris Johnson for the environment. And he has had a substantial political career, not just in Cornwall, but focusing on the fuel industry and the agriculture industry. Today, our very special guest, after 14 years of service, and as he enters a new chapter in his life post-politics, is a man that can really help us understand, as Britain enters an age with a new government, how you prepare for that and what the priorities should be in energy. Please can we welcome today former Secretary of State, George Eustice, to the podcast. So don't forget, before we introduce George, to click and subscribe for the podcast and download. And wherever you are, doing the dishes, taking the tube to work, doing that big drive to a big energy piece of infrastructure, I hope today you really learn how politicians and the energy industry can work together to move forward the energy agenda. So George, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you today. And we're going to dive straight in to understand almost the position the new government is in that you were in back in 2010. So back in 2010, George, you were a new MP. What advice would you give to those coming into being a new MP and what do you have to focus on?
Okay, well, back in 2010, when I came in as a new MP, I think that the first thing is it takes a very long time to find your feet. The first 3 months, very, very difficult. But the most important thing is to focus on a few key areas that you're passionate about and make sure that you make a difference on things. It's very easy to be distracted and buffeted in all directions. So my advice always for new MPs, find something you're passionate about and stick to that and focus on that.
Your specialisms, George, are energy and agriculture. Can you tell us how that came about?
I'd had a background in agriculture. I'd worked in the family business for 10 years. And that's why I decided, basically, when I became an MP, that I would focus on that. And I first joined the EFRA Select Committee. And that got me involved in a lot of other wider environmental issues. I was made David Cameron's policy advisor on energy issues. And so I was quite closely engaged in the energy bill and a number of other key issues in that as well. And that gave me quite an understanding of the energy sector. And then obviously during my time in DEFRA, there was quite a lot of connection between the work that DEFRA was doing on climate change and climate change mitigation and the work that BEIS, the other department on energy, were doing as well. So we worked quite closely on that.
George, how did you get involved with HVO and UKIFDA?
And my interest in HVO as a fuel came basically from seeing the project run by Mitchell and Webber in my constituency in Cornwall. And I could see straight away that this was potentially a really powerful idea, that you could decarbonise the off-grid homes by getting a 90% reduction in the carbon dioxide that you have in those areas, but do it in a way that's really easy, a small step that was very straightforward, very easy for people to follow. And that's why I got behind it and really worked to try and change the legislation in the energy bill to make sure that we had a provision for renewable liquid fuels.
Now, George, as politicians, you can't give everything to everyone. How does the government decide between energy poverty and also resolving net zero debate?
Okay, well, when it comes to that tension between energy poverty and net zero, I actually think you get it right. They can go hand in hand because, yes, initially, when you make those investments in more renewable fuels and invest in those new technologies, there's an increase in cost as well. But it does mean that over time, those costs will come down. And if you choose the right technologies and allow people to choose one, crucially, that works for their own circumstances, then I think you can actually get that transition to net zero, but in a way that doesn't cost too much. And the great advantage of approaches like using HVO is that you can use existing boilers, a simple adaptation to them. You haven't got to invest in lots of new equipment. You haven't got to strip out radiators in the home and start again from scratch. You don't have those big upfront capital costs. And so it's quite an affordable way for people to make a really significant, meaningful step towards decarbonising their domestic heating supply. And so the key thing is to make the step as easy as possible and as cheap as possible. And if you do that, then people are much more likely to take it and to take that step early. And you're actually therefore much closer to getting to net zero. Where it goes wrong is if you try and force people down basically a pathway that means they've got to spend lots and lots of money. That's when it comes unstuck, because eventually something gives and they can't do it.
Now, you got involved with the local Cornish company, Mitchell & Webb, but how does a company really get those who are decision makers and policy makers on side and further the arguments from an industry point of view?
Mitchell and Webber worked very, very hard to highlight this. They, through me, I wrote lots of letters to ministers and highlighted this within government. And I think we did make a breakthrough in the end. We were fortunate in a way that there'd been a lot of controversy and interest in the ULEZ system in London, although that isn't linked to net zero at all. It's an air quality issue. There was a realization that politically it was quite difficult to do these things. And at about that same time, there were a very large number of principally Conservative MPs, but also a lot in Northern Ireland as well, and Labour MPs in Wales, who simultaneously woke up to the fact that a premature ban on boilers on off-grid properties was going to be a political disaster for them and would be very, very difficult for the communities they represented. So I think we managed in the end to get a big breakthrough there. And once they realised that a premature ban on boilers was a mistake, it then, of course, opened the door to looking at alternative approaches.
Can you tell us some of the project results that were seen in Cornwall with this HVO project?
And the project in Cornwall at the village of Cahelland was really quite amazing. They had the local school involved, switching to HVO. The chapel had also moved to HVO. What they found is that in the church, for instance, they only needed heat some days of the week, and they wanted to be able to switch it on when they needed it and not have it running continuously. So heat pumps would have been totally inappropriate for them. And what people reported to me is that the quality of the heat that they were getting from the HVO was actually a bit better than they would get on conventional kerosene. And they typically found that the volume of HVO they were using was 20 or 30% lower than the volume of kerosene that they would have used to get the same heat output. So there were some interesting findings like that. But overall, the really big thing that people were enthusiastic about is that this was a small change that could make a really big difference for the planet and didn't disrupt their way of working too much.
Now, Keir Starmer's formed a new government here in Britain. What do you want to see on both energy and agriculture policy from Keir's team?
I think when it comes to the new Labour government, the single most important thing they've got to do now is to get that consultation out. It was a failure, really, of the last government not to do so. I'd hoped that they would get it out early this summer before the shutters came down for the election. But, obviously the disastrous decision to call that premature election had a lot of consequences. It polished off some of the legislation that the government was bringing forward. But in our case, it meant that consultation never got out. And, this was done when we changed that bill with some cross-party consensus. The Labour Party and the new government have been clear that They're going to leave the ban on boilers on off-grid properties, where it is at 2035. So they're not planning to bring that forward. And if they're not planning to bring it forward, they might as well get out the consultation that had been planned. And I hope they'll do that quickly, because my understanding was that consultation had been drafted, was just going through final clearance around Whitehall. So it should be really quite simple to get it out the door now.
What reflections, George, do you have of being Secretary of State under Boris Johnson?
Having been a Secretary of State under Boris Johnson was, it was interesting. We had an incredibly turbulent time to contend with, if I'm honest. As a country, we were trying to take a really big decision, which was to leave the European Union and become, a fully self-governing country again, and to do so, against a backdrop of a lot of tension with the European Union. They didn't want to make it easy because, they were sending a strong signal to other member states that life would be difficult for you if you contemplated leaving, the EU bloc. And that made it very, very difficult to get the right kind of settlement on Brexit. And I think in the end, we did the best that we could there. And I think things will improve over time. I mean, Boris Johnson had strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes his strengths could also become weaknesses. So his great strength was that he would knock down barriers, get things done, cast aside process in order to get a decision and to make things happen. So he was a prime minister who wanted to do stuff and would often trust his ministers and get on and do things. His weakness, though, was that, in there was a kind of slightly cavalier approach, some people might say, and that's obviously what led to his undoing, in the end. And he wasn't brilliant at doing detail. He could do detail if he applied himself, but he tended not to. So he had strengths and weaknesses, as all prime ministers do have. But overall, I think he was on a mission to do stuff and achieve things, particularly on energy and climate change. And I think it was a loss really once he went, because neither of his two successors wanted to do a great deal in that area.
How can we really drive the Cornish economy forward, George?
And then when it comes to the Cornish economy, the key thing is there's a lot of potential for new industries. It could be renewable energy, floating offshore wind, for instance. Geothermal energy has got a lot of potential in Cornwall, and there's also new potential for lithium mining and potential for tin mining to reopen as well, given the demand there is for some of those precious metals. So some of these resources issues will, I think, help spur the Cornish economy again in the future, just as it has in the past. And it's also carved out quite a niche area around digital technology, and that's also been helping Cornwall as well. But of course, parts of Cornwall are very rural, and that's why getting the right solution to people's domestic heating is also going to be really, really important. And it's why I was one of the key MPs that championed the use of HVO.
George, you did it for 14 years. What advice would you give to someone that's wanting to become a politician and entering politics?
My advice to anybody really entering politics or wanting to become a politician is remember that you've always got less time than you think. And there's only one way, in my view, to do politics, and that's once you get there and you get in a position, whether it's a ministerial position or even a position as an MP, you've got to use your time wisely, try to do things, don't put things off, don't delay things, grapple with difficult decisions and make the decision, and then get on and implement it. Because governments fail usually because they lose their way and they put off difficult things, hide from difficult problems, and it ends up in the end catching up with them. So I think there's only one way to do it, and that's to do it at full pelt, so that if all else fails at the end, and politicians don't always get credit for the things they get right, they get remembered for the things that went wrong on their watch. But if all else fails, it's important to know in your own heart what you've done, what you've achieved, whether or not you got credit for it. And that's what I would advise any MP coming in.
Is there a future in farming in Britain, George?
And I think there is a future for farming in the UK. It's actually enjoyed in the last 5 years, despite some stresses on the system, quite a profitable period of time. Farmers have seen their profits increase in most sectors. Pigs was a difficult one for 1 year, and some sectors of horticulture have struggled. But overall, if you look at cereals and dairy farming in particular, they've seen substantial increases in profitability since 2016. And that's partly because exchange rates have been in favour of agricultural profitability during that time. And I think ultimately there's a renewed recognition that resilience matters, national resilience matters, that you can't just import all of your food, that having successful, profitable domestic production is actually a really, really important part of the mix. And I think we learned that a lot during COVID, when our over-dependence on imported food looked like a major vulnerability at one point. And I think people don't recognise that it's important that we are producing more of our own food. And we do actually have some globally competitive sectors in agriculture, which, we're always in danger of talking ourselves down. We've actually got highly competitive farming sectors in this country.
And what's your next chapter, George, now you're retired as a politician?
And for me, now that I'm out as a politician, I've formed my own consultancy called Penbroath. It's just a Cornish place name. I wanted a name with Cornish heritage that English people could pronounce, and so that was the reason for it. You have to keep to about 2 syllables normally, and it's basically a regulatory and policy affairs consultancy where I'm very much focused on sectors like the water industry, natural capital, energy, and climate change, climate tech companies. So it's very interesting. I'm keeping with the DEFRA brief and the DEFRA subjects that I spent 9 years working on, but free from the politics. I'd done my share of politics and had enough of it, wanted to change. But I'm sticking with the DEFRA subjects and the environment and food and agri-food, which was always my greatest passion.
Now, George, listening to this podcast is some of the most influential directors on the boards of energy companies. Where would you really like the energy industry to invest going forward in the energy sector? So,
I think when it comes to future energy, my view has been, very clear that the electrification first strategy that the government outlined in 2017 was premature, and it was picking winners when actually the real approach of government should have been to keep the field open and to allow new technologies to come through. So I think in addition to HVO, there's a huge potential, in my view, for biomethane. I think not just collecting methane from landfill sites, but from farms and slurry lagoons. And one of the projects I'm working on is capturing methane from farms and using that as an alternative fuel as well. I also think there's potential in other areas of recycling, particularly with tyres. Pyrolysis of tyres and trying to turn that into a renewable fuel as well. And, the truth is that electrification is going to play a big role in decarbonisation, but it's not the only technology that I think we should be using. And it's not the only technology that's there to help us get to net zero. We need to use all of the tools in the box. So what I really hope that the industry will keep thinking about is how we can get that, if you like, that circular economy, completing the cycle of life. And when you have waste materials, can we turn those into biofuels that we can use to complement some of the work being done on electrification? So I've seen some very interesting ideas around pyrolysis of tyres by P66, for instance, at their Immingham plant. And I've seen companies like New Holland Tractors doing some really interesting work on methane-fueled tractors and capturing methane from farms. And there's many, many other technologies like that as well.
Finally, George, we'd like to thank you for your time today. For those who potentially want to use George and the Penbroath Consultancy Services, they'll be in the show notes below. Really thank you for your time today, George, and I look forward to catching up with you soon, talking more about energy and agriculture, and it was a great insight for our listeners.
And so thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to be on the podcast as well.
So today, guys, we heard from George Eustice, a man who'd been at the top table of government in the cabinet with Boris Johnson. And I think what I found interesting is that laser-like focus you need actually once you are a politician to be clear about what you've got to achieve in your time because you have such a short opportunity. I think it's great some of the work George has done within the energy sector within Cornwall and bring to light actually the needs that people need off-grid, such as policy around liquid fuels and HVO and kerosene in this net zero debate. I think I also found it fascinating how when we discussed about the focus that Cameron and Boris Johnson were extremely focused on energy, and almost towards the end of the parliament under Liz Truss and Rishi, George felt it got very, very lost in other issues, and now is the time to re-establish it. It was great to hear that he feels that also biomethane needs to be considered in the mix, and there needs to be investment into that, bringing his two worlds together of farming and agriculture. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please share with your friends. And if you know a great speaker who's cutting through the edge of either industry, energy, or policy making around the energy sector, please get in contact with the podcast through the website. Guys, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure. I've been Alex Wolf, your host. Thank you very much for listening to the Wolf Power Club podcast.